vintage. And not only that, he looked cold and hungry. Well, the heat was leaving from the house, so she grabbed him by the arm and said, "Were you looking for me?" And he said, "Not very much." "Well, why are you here? What do you want?" "I was looking for Christmas." "Here?" "Well, here is where I am." And she grabbed him and pulled him in the door and shut the door. He looked around and looked in wonder, and she said, help me uh, get the fire going again." And he stared at her as if he didn't know what a fire was or what he could do. Well, she got it going herself, and he stood in front of it and said, "Oh, nice." She said, "Well, what would be nicer would be a kettle on the stove. Go over, here's a bucket. Go over to the corner and fetch me some water." Well, again, he looked as if he didn't know what a bucket was or let alone a corner. So she got it herself and set the kettle on to boil and put mush into a pot on the stove as well. "I suppose you want some," he said. She said, "Well, if that's all there is." So she put a bowl in front of his place and slopped a glob of mush. Some of it went up on his cheek. She was horrified. She didn't mean to hurt him, but he just licked his cheek and said, good." Well, she poured herself some tea and put some cream on the table, and she said, "There's no sugar," even though there really was some hidden away. "What's sugar?" he said. Well, they ate their mush and drank their tea, and then he said, "Now what?" "Well, chores, of course." So she got dressed, changed in the woodshed, got on her everyday dress, and got ready to go out. And out they went, with the old woman with uproar at her heels and the ugly child following behind. He went a little off the path, and all of a sudden he said, "Is that it? Is that one?" Well, she thought there must at least be a wolf. She turned. "What?" He said, "Is that a Christmas tree?" And there in front of them was a lovely little tree that was the perfect shape and just could have been a model for Christmas trees everywhere. "Well, I suppose." The old woman took her axe and cut it down. He said, What do we do now?" "Well, we bring it into the house. We don't stand out here with it." And she brought it in and put it in a bucket, shaped some rocks around it so that it would stand up, and put it by the fire. And it indeed was a lovely tree. Almost. It was lacking some things. So she bustled around her house and found some thread and some beads and a little bell and a thimble and brought it back. And pretty soon her nimble fingers put things together and decorated that tree. And it really was a lovely tree. "Now the feast," said the ugly child. "Abominable child, you invite yourself into my house and demand a feast? Well, there's no food in here. It hasn't been for days. Well, maybe there's a ham bone and some potatoes, but no turnips, not a single turnip." "What's a turnip?" Well, soon she had that stew bubbling on the stove, and she thought to herself, if we had some bread, it would be just lovely, and found herself rolling out bread and adding the eggs and the flour and pumped it up and put it in the oven. And pretty soon the smell of that baking bread joined the smell of the ham bone stew. "Now, presents?" "Presents? Are I don't even know who you are, and here you are asking for presents. There's not anything in this house that could possibly be a present except..." Well, she went off into her corner, and she was thinking about the silver buckle that her mother had given her. It was the only thing of value that she had. And she had been thinking about the surprise that the villagers would have had when they would see her lying dead in her black dress with that silver buckle. But she wrapped it up and tied it with string, and didn't notice that at the same time that ugly child was in a corner bustling on his own. And pretty soon there were two presents under the tree. Well, the sun had passed the meridian and was heading down towards the west, and the feast was ready. So the old woman polished the pewter bowls and put out her spoons and lit some candles on the table and invited the young child and souped up that stew. And he picked up a spoon, and she said, "No, wait, no, wait. We say the dressing. For the gifts we are about to receive, Lord, we thank you." "Now," she said. And they started eating their soup, and everything felt really good, and the woman told some jokes, and the ugly child laughed, and that house was filled with the laughter and the happiness these two were sharing. Well, after the feast, he said, she went to the tree and picked up the present she had wrapped and gave it to the ugly child. He carefully held it, and he crinkled the paper and kind of shook it a little bit and opened that paper and took off the string and said, "A buckle, a silver buckle. It's the most beautiful buckle I've ever seen. I'll wear it always. You'll see." And he hugged her and he kissed her, and she was very weary from all that love. Now, the child said, "It's time for me to go." And she noticed it was dark, "But we haven't had music." But when he opened the door, the sound of bells from the church wafted up to them. And he turned and he said, "Thank you, old woman, thank you." And he walked out into the snow and pretty much disappeared. Well, the old woman closed the door and came back and sat down and started rocking by the fire. Rocking by the fire, and Uproar, her dog, was down by her side. And she said, "Uproar, what a day. It's been such a day." And she looked at the tree and she noticed there was another package under the tree. Now, what would that ugly child have found to get as a gift for her? But she went and she picked it up, and it was heavy. And she brought it to her lap and she set it down and she undid the string and opened the paper, and out came the sound of bells, the smell of stew, the scent of the lovely tree, the laughter. She said, "I will remember always." Well, Star Mother up in the sky had been waiting for her child to come home. She was starting to get worried, but she saw him coming up the arc of the sky, and he looked tired, and she couldn't tell if he looked happy, but he came towards her, and she put a shawl of stars around her shoulders and went out to meet him, and she called, how was it? How was Christmas?" "Oh," he said, "I'm so tired." And he came and she took him in her arms, and he put his head on her chest, and she said, tell me about Christmas. Tell me about your day." "Oh, Mother, I'm just so tired. I promise I'll tell you about tomorrow, but for now, what I can say is it was enough." And that's Star Mother's Youngest Child by Louise Mary. Thank you.
Let's all take a breath and smell those smells. And oh, thank you. What a beautiful way to start our swap. Thank you so much, Sarah. Lovely, lovely. All right. Our next storyteller is Ramya, all the way from Bangalore. Please. I'm going to mute.
Good evening. Can I start? Okay. Thank you so much, Sarah. Oh, what a wonderful story. And I personally believe that stories come to you, and there's a reason why stories come to you. And I enjoyed listening to you. And the story that I'm going to share today also something that came to me, and it's been inside, it's wanting to be told. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Liz. I'm so happy to be sharing the story with all of you. Once upon a time, there was a camel rider. He was leading his caravan of camels from his town through a small village, going all the way to Baghdad to sell. As he was going through the meandering paths of that village, he noticed a walled orchard. It was a walled orchard because hanging over the wall of that orchard was a branch of a tree, and hanging from those branches was three juicy, succulent peaches. Oh, they were so juicy that one of them had the skin was open and the nectar had fallen down, and ants were licking them. The camel rider stopped, and as he looked at the orchard, he thought to himself, engulfed in envy, some people are so lucky. They get to make a living in one place. Not like me, who has to travel day and night without the comfort of a family. Meanwhile, the owner of the orchard, who was sitting inside, saw the caravan of fine camels through the open gate, and he thought to himself, some people are so lucky. They get to travel the world, meet people, learn new things, while I am stuck here to one place. While the lead camel had noticed these juicy, succulent peaches, he broke a branch and started munching on it. The orchard owner was so angry that he picked up a large stone and flung at the camel. It hit the camel on the head, and the camel fell down dead. The camel rider was shocked to see his lead camel dead, and in that fit of anger, he picked that stone and flung it back at the orchard owner. It hit him on his temple and he fell down dead. A dead camel is one thing, but a dead man is another. The camel rider quickly hoped nobody had noticed him. He wanted to cut that rope of that camel and just leave that place. But he was noticed. He was noticed by the sons of the orchard owner, who caught him and said, "Murderer, murderer, you have killed our father." The camel driver fell on his feet and said, "I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. I did not mean to. It was an accident. I have a bag of gold coins. I can give you blood money for the death of your father," said the camel rider. "We don't want your blood money. We want your blood. A life for a life. You have killed our father. We cannot sit in the comfort of our home with our father anymore. We want your life." They said that, and they dragged the man to the judge's house. All the people on the way gathered. What's going on? What's going on? And they all followed this man. The judge came out and said what happened, and both of them narrated their side of the event. Well, the sons of the orchard owner were extremely adamant. They said, "We don't want blood money, but we want his life." The judge had no choice. He called the executioner, who came out with his sharp axe, rolled his sheepskin rug, and said, "All right, man, you need to kneel down now." The camel driver came down on his knees. He was devastated. He had tears in his eyes. "Hold on," he said. "I am a condemned man, haven't I?" He said. "Of course. A condemned man has a right for a last wish, doesn't he?" The judge said, "Yes, all right. Okay, what do you wish for?" "I wish to go home. I wish to go home for 3 days and 3 nights, but I will come back." "That is a very unorthodox wish, my man. How can we trust you? How do you know? How do we know that you will come back?" said the judge. That's because I say so. I will come back. I just need to go for 3 days and 3 nights, pleaded the camel driver. The judge, however, said, "I cannot let you go unless one of these good people who've gathered here can take your place. Then, only then I can let you go. Ask them," said the judge. The camel driver looked at all the people, pleaded them, and I said, "Please, please, can somebody take my place?" You, the murderer? You have come to our land, you stranger, kill one of us, and you expect us to take your place? "Die," said one. "Accept your fate," called the other from the back. Just then, "I will take his place," came a voice from behind. Everybody turned back. An old man with long grey hair and a long beard was slowly elbowing his way through the crowd. He came and stood in front of the judge and said, "I will take his place." Well, said the judge, "but old man, do you know what that means? In case the traveler, the camel rider, does not come back, your life will be forfeit. Yes, I know, and I will take his place, said the old man. All right, then, and the camel driver was given one of his camel. He jumped on the camel and just disappeared. The old man was taken into the dungeons, and all the people said, he is not going to come back, and the old man has given his life for nothing. They all went. 1 day passed, 2 days passed, 3 days passed. There was no sign of the camel driver. On the 4th morning, by now this news had spread and people had gathered from far and wide. On the 4th morning, the old man was got out. The executioner came there, rolled his sheepskin and said, "Old man, kneel down. Get ready to meet your maker." The old man started to tell his prayers when he realized his life was nothing. His life was everything. He had made his peace and he was ready to die. Just when the executioner picked up the axe and it was about to come down, "Stop!" called one. Somebody is riding, coming from that side." And there was the dust, a cloud of dust. They could not notice who it was, but soon enough, it was the camel driver. He came, he picked up the old man and said, "Old man, I'm sorry if I've caused you any distress. Now that I'm back, I'm ready to die." He knelt down on his knees. Wait, said the judge. "What just happened here?" "Camel rider, where had you been and why did you come back?" Well, the camel rider said, An old widow in my village had given me a bag of jewels for safekeeping. If I had died here that day, I would be called a thief. My sons for 7 generations would be called as thieves. I wouldn't let that happen. So I went back, returned the jewels, said my goodbyes to my wife, to my son. I sung him stories, songs. I put him to bed. And as soon as he slept, I got back on my camel and came back here. But now that I'm here, I'm ready to die." "Wait," said the judge. He looked at the old man and said, "Old man, why did you take the place of this camel driver?" The old man said, From when I grew up, a man's word meant everything. When this man gave a word that he will come back, I chose to trust him and take his place. If, however, he had not returned, I would rather die than live in a world where a man's word means nothing." "Well, impressive," said the judge. And the judge spoke. He said, I have learned that without compassion and mercy, there is no judgment. So I declare that no heads will roll, no blood will be spilt. And you," he looked at the sons of the orchard owner, "you will accept blood money for the death of your father." And they said, "Yes, we will." "Fine then, it's settled. Let's go back into the house. Let's have some pomegranate wine. Let's eat food, weigh the gold, and talk about life." That is exactly what all of them did. And that brings me to the end of my story. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ramya. That was beautiful. A story from far away to touch our hearts here. Went straight into our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz.
All right. So actually, our next storyteller is Claire, but let me pull one more now so we know who's going to come after Claire. Next will be Garth Gilchrist after Claire. So please, everyone, let's welcome Claire Castell with a story from history.
Hi, everybody. A lot of you have heard this story. It's one of my favorites, and I like to tell it at Christmas. It's called 1914 on the Western Front. And in 1914, the world was into World War I about 5 months. Everybody had thought the war would be over by Christmas. But Pope Benedict, seeing that it wasn't, suggested a temporary moratorium for a celebration of Christmas on all sides. But generals on both sides, they absolutely refused the ceasefire. And the Western Front, you probably have heard, was a line of battlefields from Belgium through France down to Switzerland. And it was one of the most bloodiest places in the war. At the Battle of Ypres, the Belgians lost 20,000. The French lost 30,000, and the Germans lost 130,000. At the battles in Somme, over 100 million lives were lost on both sides. But nonetheless, more than one unofficial truce took place on Christmas Eve day. And remember, the Western Front, the Germans are 300 yards away from the Allies, and the no man's land in between was muddy and covered with frost. We had the Allies were the English and the French, the Scottish, Belgians, and the sounds of guns and firing and exploding slowly died on Christmas Eve day. And there was quiet. Now, there was a British private, Marmaduke Walkington, I kid you not, that's the real name, reported, we heard sounds. We heard a song. Stille Nacht, Stille Nacht. The Germans were singing Christmas carols. Well, pretty soon, one of the Scots got the bagpipe going and he's playing along. And then all of the British start singing along Christmas Silent Night. And this went on for over an hour. And at the end of the evening, a German pops his head up and he says, in his best English, tomorrow, you no shoot, we no shoot. And in the morning, they didn't shoot and we didn't shoot, Walkington said. So at dawn, the Germans emerged from the trenches. And the Allies were naturally suspicious. Is this a trick? And they kind of poked their heads up. And then they saw the Germans coming out and they didn't have any guns. They were unarmed. And they came out into no man's land. And then the Allies came out and they shook hands and they exchanged gifts of cigarettes and rations. It's an amazing sight. Another a soldier reported the story. I don't know where it came from. It didn't come from our side, he says. The ball just came from their side and they made up goals. And then one fellow kicked a goal and then it was just a big kickabout. And there must have been 200 men playing football. That's soccer in American. And at the end of the day, men went back to their trenches, and the next day, the war continued. And there were stories of this truce happening in a number of places, and some think it's a myth, but I believe it was true. It was never repeated. The generals would have none of that. But to me, it serves as a proof that even beneath this brutality of war, a little bit of the Christmas spirit and holiday goodwill prevailed over the horrors of war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Some stories, we need them to be true.
Yep.
There's the facts and there's the truth. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right, I'm gonna pull one more name for sure that we'll have before the break. We might have two more, but it's Ed Silberman. So we'll have Garth and then Ed. So Marnie, if you could spotlight Garth, let's welcome Garth Gilchrist.
Hey, thank you. It's wonderful to see your faces again. It's been quite a while since I guess it's been quite a while since any of us have seen each other. I used to try to be a good storyteller, and I've done so little storytelling these last few years that I'm no interest in being a good storyteller anymore. I do love when people share their stories and love to hear them, and I like best when people tell stories from the stories that are precious to them, stories from their lives, from their own experiences that are precious. And I'll tell you a story now that my mom told me when I was a boy. Didn't have time to even run through it today, so it's hot off the press here. But I just loved the story, and I would ask her to tell it over and over again. She said that when she was a little girl, growing up on the prairie in northern Illinois, where it's very cold in the winter, that it would snow, and the snow would build up to a certain level, and then it would clear, and then the sun would create a kind of a crust of ice over the snow. Then it would snow again, and the snow level would rise, and then it would clear, and the sun again would create a crust of ice, and it would snow again, and slowly the snow level built higher and higher until the fences disappeared altogether. And when her dad, my grandpa, had to go to town, he would hitch up the horses to the sleigh, and there were bells on the sleigh and runners on the sleigh, and he would get on the sleigh, and he didn't have to follow the roads. He couldn't follow the roads. They couldn't be seen. And he didn't have to pay any attention to people's properties because they couldn't be seen either. So there were no fences. Everything was under the snow, and just made a beeline straight for town. And that's how they got anywhere they wanted to go. It was just a beeline across on this hard crust of ice that had built up over the fields. So most days were work days. Grandpa had a dairy. He had 25 head of cattle that he had at a time before milking machines had been invented. So he had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning every day of the year and milk those 25 head of cattle by hand. He always wanted to have 6 boys to help him, and he got 1 girl instead, my mom. So he did a lot of hard work. And Christmas Day then was a very, very special day because it was a day when everybody did as little as possible, and the day was set aside to be together. They all gathered at Grandma Lampert's house, which was my grandmother's mother. 75 members of the family. There were cousins and uncles and aunts and great aunts and second cousins, and everybody got together, and everybody brought their sleigh across the ice and gathered there at Grandma Lampert's house. Mom said one of her memories on the sleigh was how cold the wind was against her face, with the velocity of the horses running across the snow, and very cold. It could be 10 below, 15 below. You couldn't choose which day Christmas was going to happen. You just had to go when the day came, and it was cold. So you got all bundled up with hat and scarf and robes over your legs, and off you went. And it was a good 8 miles to Grandma Lampert's house, so there was quite it was a couple of hour trip. And she said one of her memories was no matter how cold it was, her mom, Leah, had the habit of chewing on turnips all the time. She just almost always was chewing on a turnip. And even in that cold snow, she had her hand around a turnip would be munching on the turnip as they whipped across the snow. And then they got there, and all the women went to the kitchen and started to prepare their dishes, and all the men sat around the fire and talked about the farm and smoked and made jokes and laughed, and all the kids played with each other and tumbled and did somersaults and leapfrog, and everybody had a fabulous time. And then the most amazing thing, the meal, because these were farm folks with long traditions of farm cooking for men that worked hard, and they knew it. They had to cook well. It was about their only real pleasure in life, those meals. So everybody brought their best dish, and the smells that filled the house were just extraordinary. And the tables were laden with all of these beautiful pies and cakes and casseroles and gravies and sauces and every sort of beast you could imagine roasted. And it was a grand celebration. After dinner came present opening. My mom was born in 1925, so she was 5 years old when the Great Depression hit. And people struggled. They struggled hard. And two of my grandfather's brothers lost their farms because they couldn't pay the taxes. Grandpa managed to skimp by. Mom said she got one ice cream cone a month because it cost a whole nickel, and that was too much money to spend frivolously. And she never had a toy for Christmas. She would get a coat or a pair of shoes or maybe a dress. That was her present. But the idea of getting a doll for Christmas or a toy for Christmas was just that never even occurred to people in those days. But nevertheless, they wanted to give gifts just to keep up the tradition of it, to keep up the spirit of it. And so they got creative about it, and they hung up a curtain across the front room, and behind the curtain was a big big pile of presents. And they had some months before done a draw where everybody got one name of one of the relatives, and everybody was responsible then for bringing a present for that relative. And they would wrap it, and then it was ended up in a pile behind this curtain. And behind the curtain was also an older child, probably a teenager, who was responsible for putting, well, you'll see how this goes. So there was a fishing pole, and one at a time, the family members would come up and they would cast the fishing pole, cast the line across the room and over the curtain, and the hook, big wooden hook, would fall down on the other side of the curtain. And then the child that was back there, the young person that was back there, was responsible for finding the right present to put, because they were all marked, the right present to put on the line, and then they had to reel it up, and it would come up over the curtain and fall down on the ground, and they would open it in front of everybody. So as I remember Mom telling the story, the first one to open his present was Uncle Bun, and he opened his present, and it was a pair of red polka dotted boxer shorts. And everybody got a big kick out of that. And that was a good enough present for anybody, and it was a good laugh, and that was what was most important in those days, was to laugh. And then the next person in line was Aunt Myrtle. She was a young woman. She was very pretty. She had a long shock of beautiful red hair. And it was not an uncommon sight to see Aunt Myrtle standing in front of a mirror admiring herself or combing her hair, perpetually combing her hair. So when she cast the line over and reeled it back, when she opened her present, it was a hand mirror. And of course, everybody laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed, because that's exactly what was appropriate for her. And then it was Uncle Harold's turn, and Uncle Harold took the pole and the reel, and he cast it over, and when he reeled his back, it thumped on the ground, and he picked it up and he opened it up, and there was a boot. And he said, "Where's the other one?" And a voice came from the crowd and said, "You'll get that next year." And Mom said all the presents kind of followed that line. Nothing of much value at all, but there was a lot of laughs, and everybody there got what they really wanted, which was a sense of belonging, knowing that they were part of a big, beautiful family, that everyone was welcome in, and it didn't matter how poor they were, it didn't matter how hard they were struggling, they were there together, and they were celebrating Christmas. And that was Christmas on the farm when my mom grew up in the 1930s in northern Illinois.
Thank you so much for that memory, for bringing your mother to us and for reminding us that's why we're all here. A sense, that's what we're getting, the gift we're getting tonight, a sense of belonging. Beautiful. The most important gift. Okay, Ed is our next storyteller. Ed, I need to ask you, is your story a short one or a longer one? Because
it's just under 4 minutes.
Okay, let's have that, and then we'll have our break after Ed. So let's welcome Ed Silberman.
Okay, well, I am going to tell the real story of Hanukkah. I may have told this here before. Maybe you remember. Maybe you're ready to hear it again. Or maybe you didn't hear me tell it, even if I did tell it before. So apologies for those who it's a repetition for, and hold on, because it's going to be a wild ride for those of you who haven't heard it before. It's the real story of Hanukkah, because there's so much confusion about what Hanukkah really is. Even among Jews, there are a lot of people who accept things that are really more legendary than factual, historical. So I'd like to set the story straight about exactly what Hanukkah is and how it came to be. The Jews of ancient Palestine were fighting a fierce war against a mighty king who had a huge army with all the latest modern weaponry, and they were not having an easy time of it. They were just a small ragtag band, guerrilla fighters, and they were losing battle after battle after battle until one day a brave band of Scottish Highlanders, the Maccabees, came pouring down from the mountains to come to the aid of the Jews. And side by side, the Maccabees fought with the Jews, and they beat back the king with his huge army, and they won the battle over the king and his huge army, and they won the war over the king and his huge army. And when the king was put down and his army defeated and they could live in peace, they went up to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which had been destroyed during the war. They wanted to clean it up and restore it to a place of Jewish worship. And when it was all clean, they went to light the eternal lamp that never dies, that stands over the cabinet that holds the Torah, the Holy Scripture. And they went to light that lamp. But when they lit the lamp, when they brought the flame up to the oil, suddenly the flame shot out of the lamp like today we would say a laser beam. It shot out of the lamp and it shot straight up into the sky, as high as the very zenith of the sky, and it bounced off the top of the sky and back down to earth, where it shone through the back window of a 57 Chevy that was sitting in the parking lot of an old motel. And they approached the Chevy. They followed the direction of the light, and in the back seat, they saw a mother and a newborn babe, not even a few hours old. And one of the Maccabees came over and looked in the window and said, "Jesus Christ." And he heard the sound of music. He turned to hear where the music was coming from. It was loud music. It was rambunctious, and it was coming from the bar inside the motel. So they all went over to the motel, and they had drinks in the bar, and they celebrated their victory, and they celebrated their teamwork and their cooperation. And they drank so much that they drank the innkeeper right out of all of his ale. And they were demanding drink after drink after drink, and the innkeeper had to say, "Was ale, was ale, was ale all over the town." But the Maccabees came in and they drank it all down. But the crowd was getting fierce, and the bartender knew he had to do something quick. So he went down into the basement to the reserve freezer, and he broke open the reserve freezer and pulled out all the hot dogs he had in there, fried up all the hot dogs, and gave them away for free. And that's how we got the first Thanksgiving.
Ah, Ed, I definitely have never heard you tell that before. That is unique. Thank you
True.
so much.
It's not the story you've heard before. It's a true story.
No, I never knew the truth before, so I'm glad
No,
you
you
set
did.
it straight. Okay, we're going to take our break now, but we're going to do it differently than usual. We're going to, first of all, I should tell you as far as sort of SAC business, because we're using SAC's Zoom, that it wasn't, the account was not set up to do breakout rooms. So I went in and I enabled breakout rooms on the account. I'll let Shags know that, but I just went ahead and did it. So I hope that was okay. Okay,
Our breakout room went very well. Thank you.
We're
good.
back and it went well, and I was the C, the first part of the alphabet. So I was bossy.
All right. Well, Colleen, you are actually our next teller, and Rupa, you're
Oh,
going to go after Colleen. So
Okay.
let's just
Our 2 minutes are here, so I can get some more water,
okay.
or I can stay. It doesn't matter.
We could also switch order if Rupa, you're ready, and then Colleen, you could be getting yourself some water.
Okay.
Okay, is that all right, Rupa? Are you?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Let's welcome Rupa Mohan.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here. I would like to take you back to a time about 7 years ago when my daughter was living in Boston, going to graduate school. And she was very lonely. It had been a hard time. And we decided to send her a gift. And she's a very simple girl, didn't want anything fancy. But she sent me a link to something she had wanted for a while. And it was a Groupon thing. And turned out it was a very unusual request. But I went in and I humored her and I got it shipped to her. And turns out it was a new kind of a pet. In fact, 6 of them, little brine shrimp. I don't know how many of you have heard of brine shrimp. I had never heard of brine shrimp. But I just did it to humor my daughter. And they came in a biosphere like this, ecosphere, and she was so happy. It brought her so much joy in her little dorm room in Boston, and it seemed to have really changed her whole life. She was starting to watch these shrimp every day. There were 6 of them. She had given them names, and they all, I'm sure they looked identical. I don't know how she could tell them apart. But they brought her so much joy through that, Boston winter. And she was starting to really, ramp up her doctoral work. And she was reporting back on the shrimp. And of course, we had heard that they have a lifespan of around 1 to 2 years max. So she reported that if 1 or 2 passed away and they had just disappeared, and I said, rest in peace, don't worry, the others will be well. And the 2 years later, she was ready to graduate, and we went to Boston to attend her commencement. And I got to see this for the first time. It was quite fascinating, but you had to really peek into it to actually see the shrimp. They were so tiny, maybe a third of an inch. And there were at that point 3 of them swimming around. The other 3 had perished. But they came in this little dome. And of course, there was some vegetation, some algae, and some pebbles there. And it was this whole beautiful ecosystem that was fascinating. And I don't think there were any females. I think they were all male because we didn't see them reproduce. So I think that's what we assumed. In any case, she was ready to come back home, and at that point, there were only 3. and she packed it very carefully in her suitcase, and they made this long journey on a United Airlines flight. She was a little concerned. What if it breaks? What if, the shrimp die? They can't take the pressure. But they made it. They made it back to the Bay Area, and my daughter was thrilled to see them all vigorously swimming, no jet lag, and she put them on her little shelf in her apartment in San Francisco. And things seemed to happen, very fast. Her friends came back. She was very happy. She got a nice teaching position, and she even got a new boyfriend. And so the shrimp certainly seemed to have, brought her good luck. But, nature takes its course. So year 4, couple more died. Yeah, and she was, sad, but she had to come. We had not expected them to live past a year or two, so this in itself was a miracle. And she was, celebrating them, and she got married, and her husband loved, little things like her, so they would both look at these, the last shrimp and enjoy him swimming around and, getting a lot of joy out of this. But they had to move overseas. They had decided to move to Singapore. And she says, Mom, can you look after the shrimp for me? I said, of course, this doesn't seem to be any trouble at all. It's very low maintenance, unlike other pets. So I was more than happy to house the shrimp for her. So there was only one at that point, remember? So I kept it in a dark shelf in my house, and I said, what if it dies, I don't want you to be too heartbroken. She said, yeah, I will be sad, but, do let me know, keep checking on it. So I would, every now and then when she called me from Singapore, I would check on the status and do a wellness test and say, it's doing well. Because this shrimp was really very active, and it seemed to have grown a little larger. This one shrimp was like the miracle shrimp. And guess what? It's been 7 years now. And this is the grandsire of all shrimps. I was reminded of, characters from the Mahabharata, our Hindu epic, a character called Bhishma, who had this extremely long life, and he could decide when he wanted to die. Of course, many more Indian sages who lived for hundreds of years. Of course, Abraham, Ramses II, and Methuselah. Maybe it's headed towards being Methuselah because it's gone way past its lifespan. And we are convinced that this is an old soul and it's not an ordinary shrimp. So we almost, kind of pray to it and get its blessing every now and then, because it did bring good tidings to our family. And I just now checked, it's still going strong, vigorously swimming round and round, seems to be happy and alone, in its solitude, no issues, it's growing and thriving. Well, not too bad, right? This little shrimp that seems to be a miraculous and magical little creature. And so I hope we can all learn from this shrimp to be resilient and strong and survive this crazy epidemic. And, we should not stop swimming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rupa. Don't stop swimming. We can all take that for our new motto. Very inspiring. All right. Now, Colleen, I hope that you've got your water and you're ready.
Yeah, I got my pink
All
water.
right.
That's all right.
Here we go. Welcome, Colleen.
All right. Hello. So the story I'm going to say is an old story that you've probably heard, and it has different versions. It's called Stone Soup, and there's different versions from all over Europe. They even found a version in China, and there may be a version in India. I quit reading after a while. But this is the story, and it's not it didn't happen at Christmas time, but it has sort of the Christmas spirit in it. There was a war, and the war had ended in between several countries, and there was 3 soldiers, and they were traveling home, except they had to walk because they're, the horses were either killed or died in the battles. And they walked, and after a few days they ran out of food. And so they went to a village, and oftentimes in many countries it's present to give soldiers or travelers or strangers a meal, and then they can move on. But these people, the war had been fought in their territory. In fact, this was sort of a borderline territory of the thing, because some of the people in town had supported one side and some of the people in the town had supported the other side. And so they were suspicious of their neighbors, of any strangers. Oftentimes when there's war, the soldiers from the other side will occupy your town and take your food, or the government from your country will destroy your food so the other soldiers won't get it. And so people had hidden food, and they didn't want to bring it out they didn't want anyone else to know, because their family would run out of food if they told anyone else about it. But the war was over. So the soldiers asked, they stood in the town square and they spent all day asking for, well, can we have a little food? Just please. And no one said. They just get stared at and looked. And finally, one of the soldiers said, I have a plan. Well, being soldiers, they had taken a big crock, a big iron pot, and that was part of their gear. So one of the soldiers went down to the creek and he scrubbed out the pot and he filled it with water. Another of the soldiers built a fire. And the third soldier says, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to put what we have in the soup. So he went down to the creek again and he washed out 3 stones and he put them in the pot. And this started to boil. Well, then all of a sudden people walked by and they looked and they says, what are you doing? This is, we're making our stew, our feast for dinner. And they looked and there's just stones in there. And then someone said, you know what? I might have some carrots in my cellar. Let me go home and get them. So they went home and brought out carrots. And another person says, I don't think when they last raided us, they got all the potatoes from my garden. So he went and dug out in the garden, and there were still some potatoes there. So they went there, and he says, that, and then someone else walked by, and they say, well, there's, and so this kept happening and happening, and more food kept showing up for this stew. So by the time it was time, as this darkness was falling, the pot was full of vegetables and greenery, and people brought their bowls, and everyone had enough to eat because everyone had brought there was full. And then as it got dark, fire sort of mesmerizes people, and they just wanted to sit around and walk. And then sometime someone said, well, I have this story that my mother told me. And then they told it, and someone had the story. I had this story that my great grandfather told me, and they told that story. And then they realized they had a lot of things in common because they'd been living next to each other all this time. And then someone brought a fiddle out, and someone brought their drums, and they started playing music, and they started to dance, and they went to sleep, and they woke up, and they were a village again the next morning, and the soldiers went on. And that's the end of the story. So thank you.
Colleen, thank you so much. I have heard many versions of that story since I was a child, but never one where stories were one of the most, was an ingredient.
Well, I added that because I was telling it
all
here.
love that. Thank you. Well, you know what? I have 2 more names in the hat. And in order to hear both these stories, I'm sure we're going to have to go over the 8:30 mark. And then Sally is going to wrap up. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, if there are people who need to leave, we understand. But I'd love to see I'm going to go gallery view, but I'd love to hear these last two wonderful storytellers. So I see enough nodding heads. Okay, Sally's is the most important nodding head. Okay, so our last two storytellers will be Irene Sardanis and Ed Lewis. So Marnie, are you able to spotlight Irene?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
This story comes out of my book, Out of the Bronx. It's called The Tree. I've seen many Christmases in my life, but there is only one that stands out. I was 10 years old in my Greek home, my Bronx tenement in New York. And I was alone with my mother, who was very depressed and hardly ever getting out of bed. So she was in bed as usual. And it was Christmas Eve. And as a kid, of course, I wanted to celebrate like my friends did. So I went into her bedroom and I said, "Ma, it's Christmas Eve. Can't we get a tree? Give me $1 and I'll go and get a tree." "What?" She says, "Don't bother me. No. Go away." So I went back into the living room where the clock was ticking, and the refrigerator in the kitchen was groaning. And then I went back into the bedroom. "Ma," I said, "please, can I have $1? I'll go out and get a tree. I'll try to find a tree." "What do you say?" She says, "Oh no, and I don't have any money." And I'm starting to hear the same old stories of how poor we are, but I just stood there in front of her bed, and I didn't move until finally she took her purse out of the back of the pillow she was sleeping on or resting, and took $1, crumpled $1, and she gave it to me. And bam, I was out the door in a minute, running down those stairs out into that street. It was freezing cold, and I could see my breath out of my mouth. It was that cold. And then there was no one on the street, and I was thinking, what have I done? What am I going to do? But I decided to go to the shopping area in the Bronx called Prospect Avenue. And I started walking there. And I look at one of the apartments, and I can see in the apartment there's a tree and kids playing around it. And I was thinking, oh, I want that too. I want that too. So I kept going. And then I passed a church, and I could hear Christmas music or organ music or something. And I was praying like a kid, "Please, God, help me get a tree." And then I kept walking, and I got to Prospect Avenue, and the first place I saw was a produce store. And I went in and I said, "Please, mister, do you have a Christmas tree I could buy? I have $1 here." He said, "What's the matter with you, kid? Don't you know there's a strike on?" There's always strikes in New York, right? "No, we didn't get any trees." "Oh." I left. Well, I think he said, "Here's an apple." He gave me an apple. I took the apple and I left. Went down to the next store. It was a bakery. "Is there any tree that you might have?" I asked the guy. He said, No, I'm sorry, little girl, but here's a cookie." He gave me a cookie. I kept going. I went to the Italian deli, where I remember getting all these wonderful samples. And I asked them, "Do you have a Christmas tree? I have $1. "Nope, but here's a piece of salami." So I left, and I went out into the street, and I started to feel so hopeless at that moment. I was cold. And then I saw 2 policemen coming towards me, the big Irish guys, you know. And I went up to them, and I stood in front of them, and I was speechless, and I just burst into tears. What's the matter, little girl? What's the matter? I want a Christmas tree and I can't find one. So they took my hands, both of them, cold hands, and we started walking and checking the stores that were all closing on Christmas Eve. And no, none of them had a tree. And at that point, I gave up. My teeth were chattering. I was so cold. And I said, I think maybe I go back home now. And they nodded yes. But just at that moment, a truck filled with Christmas trees were barreled on around the corner. And the cop whistled it down and said, wait. Went up to the truck driver, pointed to me, pointed to the Christmas trees, went in the back, took a small one down and set it in front of me. Oh my God, I couldn't believe it. I still remember the smell of the pines in my nostrils, how fragrant it was, and how holding the tree, my little hands could hardly put them around the trunk of the tree, and how it hurt to hold it. And I looked at them and I just gave them the crumpled dollar, and they shook their head. No, Missy, this is Christmas Eve. Merry Christmas. So I half carried and half dragged that clump car, the Christmas tree, back to the apartment and up the stairs. And I went in and I looked at my mother, and I wish I could tell you that she smiled, that she said she was proud of me for finding that tree and bringing it. But hers was a small world that she could not escape. But I will tell you, the memory of that Christmas Eve remains in my heart forever, and I'll treasure it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene, for sharing that memory with us. We've had two Ramya at the beginning of our evening, and now Irene, who are new voices, I believe, who we haven't heard, tell a story before at our swap. And we're so happy to have both of you. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's hard enough to do it when it's in person, to get, for the first time, like in a new setting. And so thank you both so much. And thank you, Irene. All right. Our last storyteller, except for Sally, is Ed Lewis, who is on the board, I want to mention, of the Storytelling Association of California. And so very appropriate to welcome you to tell us a story.
Thank you. There once was a very old woman whose eyes were dim, her ears were dull of hearing, and her mind wandered to places only she was familiar with. Her family would often find her hitchhiking, naked at the age of 90, down the road south of Happy Camp, California, which is just south of the Oregon border. Her daughter and son-in-law became increasingly disturbed by her behavior, and she would often hurt herself. She would be walking along cliffs barefoot. She'd get her feet cut. People would find her, and she would be speaking words that no one could understand. They went to their relatives and said, so what can we do? We can't really care for her anymore. We don't know what to do. And this is back in the 50s. The relative was kind of the old coot, a family embarrassment. And they said, just put her in a rest home north of Seattle where she grew up, and we can come and see her, when we can. And that is what they did. They put her up in a rest home. Unfortunately, this rest home was dirty, it was cheap, it was understaffed. It wasn't really a place for anybody to be in. I, though, on the other hand, saw my grandmother, Sadie, as this wise, playful, elderly woman who used to take care of me when I was a young child. My fondest memories are of walking down to my bedroom at night, and she would hold my hand, and I would stand in the doorway. She would turn on the light, and then she'd say, "Stand here. Don't be afraid. Don't move." And she would rush into the room. She'd take out her sword, and she would smash all the dragons and lions and alligators that were under that bed. And then she would come and pick me up, carefully place me in bed, tuck me in, and she would tell me stories of fanciful and faraway places. And as I was getting ready to just drift off into this fairyland that she brought me to, she would sing me what is my favorite song today. And many of you know it. And if you know it, please sing along, do whatever you feel like. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Grandma's gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird won't sing, Grandma's gonna buy you a diamond ring. And if that diamond ring turns brass, Grandma's gonna buy you a looking glass. By about that time, my eyes are closed and I was just drifting off to this fairyland. Up in Seattle, the rain was pattering down on the roof, which is today one of my favorite sounds, which I just got to experience last night in my own home. The family very seldom saw her in the rest home, but after about 4 months, I visited her. I was almost 19 years old at that time. And I came in, they brought us into this dimly lit room. It was supposedly the family room. There were no posters. It was a TV in a corner, the shades were drawn. It was a horrible place. And we sat at the table. And she has what we now know as Alzheimer's. And she didn't recognize me, but we sat down at the table and she started talking. I had no idea what she was saying. Maybe another language, words that were her own words. I don't know. But I listened to her and I was transported back to that time when I was a young child, just listening to her voice. I just felt the love and compassion pouring out of me. And then all of a sudden, it seemed like an hour went by. And her eyes had been glazed over and she'd be looking up at the ceiling. And all of a sudden, she looked directly into my soul. She pointed a finger at me and she said, her eyes cleared up and she said, "Eddie, don't ever put your parents in a death camp like this. This is no place for the living, and I won't be living much longer." And then her eyes glazed over. She looked up and went off to wherever she went off to. About 2 weeks later, passed away peacefully. The family had kind of a hushed, guilt-ridden funeral up in Seattle. But I never forgot the many lessons that my grandmother taught me. And in 2012, my father came down with Alzheimer's. My mother cared for him for about 8 months in Santa Rosa, and I live in Davis. It was about an 80-mile drive, and I would see him, and he had lost his short-term memory, but his long-term memory was fine. And he was in good health, so he could go for walks. The problem was, though, he would hide things at night. He'd be up at different times during the night. He would hide things, and then he would be in a rage because he couldn't find him in the morning. And one day he grabbed my mother, slammed her up against the wall and said, "You know where my boot is. You, the gardener took it. You go get him right now." And that was it for her. She said, "I can't care for him." But she wanted him near. So we found a really nice assisted living home. And he had his own room because, again, he could still get around and he could communicate. And he knew who family was, but he didn't recognize a lot of people that he didn't know very long. But after a year there, they said, "We've got to put him in lockup because he's getting too violent in the morning. We just can't handle his behavior." So for the next 3 years, I brought him into my home. And with the help of family, friends, And the last 6 months of his life, hospice workers, we cared for him. My son moved in for the first year of his time with us before he went away to college. I hired him and he took care of my dad during the day while I was working. He had the great idea to get my dad a dog. So we found a rescue dog. It was a Yorkie, and it was just like the Yorkie that he had named Susie back home with my mom. And we would go visit my mom every weekend. And he would bring his new dog, which he named Susie. He didn't remember his old dog, Susie, but the dogs would just go crazy over him when we got back to my mother's house. The other great thing about that dog was that the dog would look at him and he would say, "Oh, you want to go for a walk?" And he would take her out. For the first 2 weeks, I went with him, or my son went with him, and we had this walk for about 6 blocks that he could go on. I put scarecrows in the front yard so he could remember where the house was. And he did that. And eventually he got to where he could do it by himself. But Susie was smart. She would look up at him and she'd go, after about an hour after her last walk, and he'd say, "Oh, hey, Susie, you want to go for a walk?" And he would take her out again. He went out about 10 times every day. All the neighbors knew him. It was a good experience. Well, again, he was, again, his long-term memory was fine. I heard all the family stories over and over, and I'm very thankful for that. My son appreciates the time he had with him. And on the third year, he was in hospice care at our house, and they said he's getting ready to pass. And my son and I were there, and we remembered what his mother, my grandmother, did for him. And shortly before he died, we dressed him in his finest suit, combed his hair, and my son and I held his hands and we sang that song to him. And I can get through it. Let's end it with that song. Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird won't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring. And if that diamond ring turns brass, Mama's gonna buy you a looking glass. I love you, Grandma Sadie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you.
Welcome.
I am going to turn it over to Sally in just a moment, but before that, a brief commercial intermission, which what that means is I'm stopping my video and asking Marnie to spotlight me or keep the spotlight on me so that when this recording goes up, everybody sees the Storytelling Association of California logo, and we can all use the reminder that we are only one of many, many swaps and many other wonderful events that SAC is doing great guns on Zoom. It's really exciting how all of us from all over California are coming together. So thank you, SAC, for all your support of our swap. And so, Marnie, can you spotlight Sally?
Oh, here I am. Hello. All right. Well, let's see if I'm going to stand up. There we go. Okay. Thank you again so much for coming and being with us tonight. It was lovely. I think it was just a lovely evening. The stories were so heartfelt and entertaining and of the season. It was just lovely being with you all. And I'm going to end with a story that I have told every year for the last 18 years. So if you've heard it before, I'll shorten it quite a bit so that we can leave. But it's about my childhood, and it's the year 1940, and I am 6 years old. and living in a little town called Gastonia in North Carolina. And the people are very busy on my street because we had a convent at the end of the street, and it was Christmas time, and the nuns would come out in their black habits and they would wear smocks, and they would set up this life-size creche outside of their gate, and they would paint the robes of Jesus, of Mary and Joseph, and they would put a new splint on the lamb, and they would take the baby Jesus and get new straw for the manger, and they would put this beautiful creche out on the street near the gate of their place. And then the fathers would be stringing the colored lights, not white lights, not purple lights, all the different colors, colored lights onto the roofs of their houses. And the beautiful wreaths would go on the door, Carolina pine wreaths. And some people would take and put bows on the garages so that the garages look like big presents, and the houses would just look lovely. And then at night, for the picture windows and the bay windows, there would be these wonderful, wonderful tinseled, jeweled Christmas trees. And at our house, we had a porch light, and in our bay window, there was a Louis XIV table, and on that table, there was a white porcelain lamp with a gold pleated shade. We had no decorations. There were not a sign of Christmas in our house, but there was a whiny little 6-year-old girl who followed her mother through the house as the mother took the carpet sweeper and cleaned the rugs. But why can't we have a Christmas tree? Why can't we have a wreath? Why can't we have just little light, just a little light? How will Santa Claus know that I'm here? Sally Joy Gottlieb. The use of 3 names brought me to attention. We are not having a Christmas tree. We are not having Christmas lights. We are not having a wreath. And I would appreciate it if you would not sing Christmas carols in the house. I have to hear those all the time when I go to the store. But Mama, everybody has a Christmas tree. No, everybody does not have a Christmas tree. The Liebers do not have a Christmas tree. The Sapersteins do not have a Christmas tree. The Liebers and the Sapersteins were friends of my mother's and the only other Jewish families in town. But they have big children. Their children don't care if Santa Claus comes. Oh, Mama, please. No, Sally. But how will Santa Claus know that I'm here? I will get your father to write a letter to Santa Claus on his company stationery, and he will make it quite clear that there's a little girl in the house that wants a special Christmas present. And I did want a special Christmas present. I wanted a Shirley Temple bridal doll. I had seen her in the toy department of Belk's department store in Charlotte. She stood on the counter and she had this wonderful veil that went all the way down to the countertop. And when I lifted the veil and looked at her little mouth, her little face, she had a little face and had a little bud mouth and a little short nose and eyes that opened and closed. She was the most beautiful, beautiful doll I had ever seen in my whole life. I wanted that doll so badly. Well, I was going to make sure that Santa Claus knew I existed and that at least he would hear me. And so in school, when they sang the Christmas carols, I sang with great gusto. Hark the herald angel, Sally, shh, not so loud, please. I couldn't believe it. But my daddy said that he had written the letter and that he had sent it off to Santa Claus, and I trusted him. And then it was Christmas Eve, and my mother made for our dessert her very, very special 3-layered chocolate cake with chocolate frosting in between. And when my daddy cut the cake for dessert, he gave a piece to my mother and a piece to me, a piece to himself, and a great big piece for Santa. Sally, go get the Haviland china plate and the sterling silver fork for Santa. And Mother put the cake on the china plate with the sterling silver fork, and she poured Santa's milk into a perfectly lovely crystal goblet, and then put the plate and the goblet and the fork on the Louis XIV table and turned on the light. I'll tell you, Sally, When Santa Claus gets a whiff of that chocolate cake, he's going to come right down here and put your Christmas trees right in the living room. You mark my word. Everybody else is just putting out cookies. Can't match your mother's cake. Well, I went to bed early that night and I left the window open just a little bit. And then I laid on my bed and I sang every Christmas carol I knew, hoping that the reindeer would hear me and come directly to my house. Now, our neighbor had a rooster, but I was up before that rooster. And I went down and looked down the hall to see if my daddy's office door was open, and it was, and there was a light, and I ran in there. Daddy, did you go in the living room? Daddy, did Santa Claus come? Daddy, did they bring the doll? Daddy, we have to wait for your mother. No, Daddy, please, let's just go just look a little bit into the living room. So we went and we looked into the living room, turned the corner, looked into the living room. There she was, the Shirley Temple bridal doll. She was sitting on the hearth with her wonderful bridal train. And I went and grabbed her. Oh, Daddy, isn't this the most beautiful doll you've ever seen? And look, there was a steamer trunk on the floor and it had doll clothes in it, a dress, a little skirt, a little jacket, and it had little drawers. And I opened the drawers and there were underwear in those drawers. Come, Daddy, come, let's dress the doll. And my daddy came and sat down on the floor with me and we started to dress the dress and undress the doll. Sally, what are you going to call this doll? I think you should call her after your mother. Your mother was such a beautiful bride. Fanny Ida. Daddy, I don't think Fanny Ida is a good name for a bridal doll. Maybe I'll call her Frances, and then maybe Mother will change her name. No, I don't think I will. And there was my mother standing in the living room door. I thought you were going to wait for me. No, come sit on the floor with us. And then we sat on the floor, my mother and my father and myself, dressing and undressing this beautiful bridal doll that I love so much. And that night, we stood the doll up on the Louis XIV table, and we made sure that her bridal veil was spread out so that all could see. And we turned on the light, and anybody who passed our house would look into the window and know that Santa Claus had come to Sally Gottlieb's house. And here she is, the Shirley Temple bridal doll. All these years.
Oh, Sally.
So take your memories and cherish them, the good ones and the bad ones. And I'm sure that next year when we talk about this season, we'll remember this swap, I hope. So blessings on you all. Blessings to your families. Be of good cheer. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sally.
Bye-bye. Love you all. Thanks so much.